Hey guys, this is Phil Galfond from BlueFirePoker.com. Today I'm going to be doing something new and doing a member review video. And also it's a little bit new because this is a lower stakes video, or more beginner video than I normally make. Um, so as always, I think when I try something new, I really appreciate your feedback, and it gives me an idea of how well the like type of video is being received, what's good about it, what's not good about it, and then I can gear my other videos to fit the feedback that I get. I guess it's probably a bad way to word that. So I got this video after posting my blog that I was looking for some videos to review. This is the only PLO video I've received so far, and I did get the warning, a warning in the email that this player Hypoxia is pretty new to PLO, and so I expect to see some beginner mistakes. I skimmed through the first like 3 minutes of the video and had already seen a few beginner mistakes, so I wanted to gear this video kind of towards new PLO players. Mostly I think, especially for members of this site, that demographic will be players who are pretty competent and have played No Limit for a while and are transitioning to PLO. Um, and so I've jotted down some notes and things of concepts to talk about for PLO beginners. I know that many of you watch my videos for more advanced PLO stuff, but I'm changing it up this week, and I have wanted to make a member review for a while, a member review video, that is. So he has two tables here of 25 cent, 50 cent, although this player on the right is sitting out. He sits in soon, I'm pretty sure. The one thing I noticed in the first few minutes of the video was that we were folding too many buttons, far too many buttons. This last hand over here, which was like King Queen 6-3 Rainbow, is not that big a deal to be folding. I would open it against most opponents, but there's some very clear opens that we were missing. So I think he's showing... Okay, so he's showing me this hand that just occurred. He gets 3-bet, calls, flops top pair, second nut flush draw, and gets it in. And I think this plays fine. I think you have options, and it kind of depends on the type of opponent that you're against. But I think as a standard, I would be jamming here. And I guess I could talk about a few of the reasons that you would jam instead of call. And I think what it comes down to in PLO, more than in No Limit, although this is true of No Limit, and this is something actually that PLO made me realize a little bit about No Limit, is it's not just about your hand strength and his most likely hands, or his range of hands, and like your equity against those hands. When you're considering how to play your hand now, especially when you're considering getting it in now as opposed to calling and waiting to see a turn, you have to think about the way your hand plays out on the turn. And so first of all, we can talk about hot and cold equity. This is a board that, if you run into kings, if you run into aces, the only hand you're really screwed against is aces with the nut flush draw, and that is very rare. You have an ace blocker. I mean, you have 3 hearts in your hand, and just it's already going to be rare to begin with. So you're doing fine against anything. When you run into kings or aces, you're pretty much a flip, probably slightly ahead. When you run into like 9, 10, jack, queen, you're pretty much flipping or somewhere near there. It's not super important, but basically you're never far behind. Occasionally you're very far ahead against a hand like jack 9, 8, 7 for like middle pair and a wrap. You're in very good shape against those hands. And you have some fold equity as well. I would expect if an opponent is 3-betting a tight range, he's not going to be folding this board very often just because nothing really missed. A player 3-betting a more loose range that would include like ace, king, jack, deuce, single suited. Now that's a hand that can miss this board and ace king 7-4 double suited, things like that can miss this board. But against a person 3-betting in tight range, they're not going to miss this board. So if you have a hand that, so let's say in this spot you just have ace king 7-6. Let's make it a little bit worse. So like ace king 6-3 with second nut flush draw. That's a spot where you do not want to be jamming, just because you have pretty much no fold equity and you're pretty much guaranteed to get it in, 30%, like 40%, probably 33% on average if you count the times that your pair outs are and your backdoor 2 pair outs are no good and your flush draws are no good, and then combine the times that you have your 35+% equity. But anyways, a hand like this, we're happy to get in. We're fine getting in. And like I was saying, we consider waiting to see a turn. The problem with seeing a turn with this specific hand is that he's going to be playing fairly well against our specific hand on turns. What I mean by that is, when the turn is a 4 of hearts and he's sitting there with kings, like king, king, queen 4 or something, or like ace, king, king, queen, he's just going to check fold. We don't get any value out of our hearts. If the turn is an offsuit jack, now this is like a tricky spot to play, because if he checks to us now, we can consider turning our hand into a bluff. But we have so much equity that it's kind of scary to have to bet fold, or potentially like bet call, or like pot and commit ourselves, and then call a jam when he should be jamming there with super premium hands. So it's kind of difficult for us to know when to bluff, and it's also difficult. I mean, he's going to be jamming well, like on a offsuit 3, he's going to be potting, and we're going to be calling or getting it in then, and our equity will be worse than it is now. Whereas if we had a hand like Queen Jack, let's say like Queen Jack 8-5, so we have the wrap and bottom pair, now waiting to see a turn becomes a lot more attractive, because if the turn is a 3 of hearts and he's sitting there with ace or kings, he's going to check fold, and that's a very good bluff spot for us. And if the turn is obviously brings any of our straights, he's in a very tough spot with his like aces with flush draw. He kind of just has to go with it, and we get it in with better equity. If the turn is a heart and he continues to bet, we can probably get away from our hand and would have gotten it in on the flop with pretty bad equity. So that's kind of like the concept of how the hand's going to play out on future streets, even though those are, I mean, Queen Jack 8-5 is slightly worse than this hand, but they're both hands that, you can get your stack in with. This is a hand that would much prefer to get it in on the flop and not see a turn, whereas Queen Jack 8-5 would love to see a turn. Turn 5, you get a ton of value, etc., etc. Anyways, enough time on that. We get it in against King 10-9-9. Obviously, that's a terrible hand to run into, but we do have our flush draw is still live, and now we have backdoor boat outs. I guess mostly just the ace or the king for the chop. What I would take from his play is that he's willing to 3-bet. I would call this lighter than average. Certainly not spewy, in my opinion, but this is not a 3-bet that I make. I think it's just a little bit too disconnected. You too often flop like top pair with bad side cards, or you flop, like on a queen high board, you have a pair of 9s for an under pair, and you have a 10 high flush draw. So it gets pretty tricky. So I prefer to just call in the big blind with his hand. I don't really like his 3-bet, but it's not terrible in my opinion. But you need to be paying attention to how light they're 3-betting, and that actually does have something to do with how light you can open the button, and obviously how you play post flop. So here in the left table, we call in the big blind. Ace King 8-7 with a suit. I fully agree with that call, and we check call the flop on King Queen Queen, which is very standard. And at this point, if he continues to bet, I think it just comes down to what we think of him as a player. I think it's a very opponent-specific spot. We call pretty quickly here. I don't know, like, it's certainly not a bad call. It's certainly a fine call against a lot of opponents. But just in case you are calling quickly because you think it's, the easiest call in the world against everybody. It's definitely not. I think it's a close spot. This is a board where when you check call the flop, oftentimes people put you on, like your hand at worst, maybe King Jack 10 at worst, and oftentimes a queen with bad side cards, or like King Queen or King King that you're slow playing. So I don't find that people barrel here with a super high frequency. So it really comes down to your opponent, and as far as, is this check call correct? I don't have like a general advice on it. But it seems like maybe slightly bad on average against most opponents, but it's fine, certainly. So he's betting twice with Ace Jack Jack 6, which I don't really understand. I guess he's hoping to fold out your exact hand, but he's not getting value from anything, certainly. That was definitely an open on the button, like trashy double suited hand. That was an open as well. Like any 4 unpaired cards that you have a suit is pretty mandatory open against anybody that is, unless they're like insanely aggressive and are 3-betting a lot and playing well in those 3-bet pots. When you get into like rainbow hands and like paired rainbow hands, like a pair of 5s, and obviously any trips you can fold, but really you need to be opening near 100% of your buttons. 8-6, 8-8-6-4 could go either way, calling or folding. I think I would fold. I like to play tighter out of position. So this player on the right has limped his button. We're going to assume that he's a pretty weak player. And as far as how I would react to his limping, again, I would just raise that. Like any single suited, at least, hand I would raise the button with. I like to see how he plays first. Obviously you can just, with your weaker hands, take a free flop in the big blind, but I would start donking out with a pretty high frequency, just because I expect him to, not just with strong hands or with weak hands, with, somewhat of a balanced range, and depending on the board texture, but I would do it with weak hands on boards where, I expect a lot of folds, and with stronger hands on boards where I expect more action, or expect more calls with hands that might have checked behind, especially if he's a passive player. Yeah, you just have to check fold here. One thing that I did jot down that I want to talk about was deciding when to bluff in PLO is a little bit different than deciding when to bluff in No Limit, in my opinion. People play their hands differently. First of all, people are playing their hands. I guess I can play this out while I talk about it, and obviously you're going to c-bet with your double gutter and bottom set and be happy to get the money in. Not happy, but, well, happy. In PLO, people are betting, and this is an open. I'm going to stop talking about how many times we should be opening the button. We have to be opening a lot more. In PLO, people are often betting to protect a lot more. This is a spot on the right where I would lead out, just because you can't really check call, but, you have, like, okay equity and, some outs against hands, but you're not going to want to check call with this. I don't know what to make of his limping range, but it probably, includes less good aces, or less aces in general. So I would just bet the flop and then give up after there, probably. Given that I think he'll be pretty call-y. Anyways, sorry for the rambling, or not even good rambling yet. What I'm trying to say is that people are betting to protect a lot more in PLO than they are in No Limit. So that they're a lot more unpolarized. And, on certain board textures, it's really tough to have anything. That's true of No Limit. And I did make a video, if you are new to PLO, that you should definitely go back and watch. It's very quick. And it's like a concept video on lockdown boards. I think it's like a 10-15 minute video. But essentially the point is that there are certain boards that kind of play the same way that like the King 7 Deuce or King Deuce Deuce boards do in No Limit. Because King 7 Deuce and King Deuce Deuce aren't quite as bluffable in PLO as they are in No Limit. But boards that are boards where it's very difficult for somebody to have a lot of outs if they don't have, the nuts or near nuts. And those are boards like 3 straight boards, 3 flush boards. Paired boards count as well, but so on a flop of, if this were Jack 3-4 all hearts, that's a spot where if he doesn't have a flush or a set, he doesn't really have many outs against any legitimate hand that you would be putting a lot of pressure on with. So those are the boards that are good to come after in PLO. But I think, like, a generalization I would make about PLO when compared to No Limit, and I think this is especially true at lower stakes. I'm going to back up and watch this hand again, but I want to make the point first that it's a lot more about their range than your range at PLO when compared to No Limit. In No Limit, I like to bluff. I'm very careful, and I still am at PLO, but I'm very careful about representing a hand when I'm bluffing. And if it's a spot where it's very tough for me to have a big hand, I'm not going to be, or like a value hand, I'm not going to be bluffing very often. It should go without saying. And they're going to be thinking about your hand, things like that. However, in PLO, it's kind of difficult to put people on exact hands, especially when, like, if the board doesn't change, it's kind of tough to rep a strong hand if you've been playing your hand passively. But when the board changes, given that you have 4 cards, it's very conceivable that you had something and backed into something else. And some boards it's less true than for other boards, but especially at lower stakes, I would say that I would base my bluffs a lot more on what I think they have and how strong or weak their range is and how likely they are to fold their most likely hands, and worry a little bit less about what I'm representing, just because it's so easy to like back your way into something or to have hit something when the flush draw comes in. I think it's more important to think not just about how likely is it that I have a flush draw. It's more important to think how likely is it that they had a flush draw. Because no matter how the hand played out, it's pretty possible that you had a flush draw when the flush comes in. So it's a lot more about what they have. Anyways, so this hand on the right table, I'm going to back it up a little bit more. We raise the button. Good. Flop nut flush draw and a gutter. And I agree with the c-bet. We can stand some heat with this hand. We want to get value from, I don't know. You want to get value from worse flush draws, even though we have just a pair of deuces right now, but we want to build the pot when we flush over flush them. And we have good equity against any hand here. When we turn the double gutter, I think this is pretty mandatory 2-barrel. The queen being an overcard and giving us the double gutter is a good reason to 2-barrel. First of all, if he's sitting here with just a jack, like ace jack 7-6, now this queen makes his 2-pair outs look a lot weaker. I mean, it makes his 2-pair outs a lot weaker because he could be drawing dead, or he could hit a jack. But if we have queen 4, his 6 and his 7 are no good. Whereas when the jack's still the top card, it's a lot easier for his 2-pair outs to be good, and he can talk himself into calling more. So the queen being an overcard helps. We can also stand a check raise here. Not that I expect to get check raised very often, but I mean, we have good equity against anything. I think it's like a mandatory bet. And if he has, like ace 7-6-4 with 7 high hearts, I think it's like criminal to let him get to showdown and show his hand down with a 4 and beat us. There are just too many hands that he's folding right now, and our equity against his range is good, and we could stand a check raise, and we want to build a pot for when we hit. Now that we hit the ace, I don't think there's any value, especially with it bring a couple 3 straights, so just check it down and hope to win. And so here he did have, I mean, had he got to showdown with his ace 7, 4 deuce, no suit, I mean, he was definitely folding the turn. That's just like a massive mistake, like to let that hand get to showdown, to let so many weak hands get to showdown against our pair of 2s when we have such a strong draw. So I think pretty big mistake to check there. And so along the same lines with how it's kind of tough for them to read our hands. It's a little bit tougher to read their hands, and hand reading in PLO is different than No Limit in that you don't put them on a specific 4-card hand. You kind of put them on a, feels like they could have a pair plus flush draw here, they could have like a wrap, they could have pair plus open ender, they could have two pair, things like that. You try to guess like 2 to 3 of their cards, or like the general idea. And then, as the hand goes on, and the scare card hits, it really comes down to frequencies and how likely you think they are to bluff when they didn't have it, how likely they are to, like, how thin they're going to value bet, how many of those, like, how much of their range contain the flush draw, things like that. But it's much tougher than a no limit to put them on a specific hand, and so it does come more down to frequencies and balancing in those spots. As you get, as you move up and play against tougher players, you have to be more careful to balance, and that you're not bluffing every time the scare card hits when you don't have it, because they're going to pick up on that. However, lower stakes, like I said, just focus on what they have. On the left table, we 3-bet ace-ace, 9-deuce with a suit. Against a kind of looser passive player, this is good. Against any kind of tough player, I think this is too weak of a hand, in my opinion. Unless it's the type of tough player that 4-bets very frequently, and then we can get most of our stacks in. But what happens with this is, we're a little over 100 big blinds deep, and what happens on most flops is we'll have $9 in the middle and about $55 in our stack, and we're going to flop top pair with no real other outs, or sorry, an overpair with no real other outs. And so any hand that he is willing to go with on the flop is either, flipping with us or has us in very bad shape. Unless we flop, an ace, which is very unlikely, or a flush draw, which is not that great. Or sorry, not super likely is what I meant. So a hand like ace-ace, 9-8 with a suit is a much better hand, because we can so often flop a gutter or an open-ender to go with it, open-ender plus flush draw, and then we can, get it in like as massive favorites, and we can stand a lot more heat. This is a hand that becomes very tricky to play, kind of in the same way that, well, we flop top set, not as tricky, kind of in the same way as a no limit. If you 3-bet with pocket fives, it's tricky to play after the flop, in most cases. I think that's actually kind of similar, although pocket fives doesn't want to get all the money, or isn't excited to get all the money in pre-flop, where pocket aces in PLO certainly is. So some more weak button folds here. On the right table, this is a flop. I would go ahead and lead. I mean, against a weak player, that is. Obviously, you can't just be leading 100% of your air against anybody competent, but this is a board that's, if he doesn't have a jack or a 6, and he doesn't have a flush draw, he has to fold. Just because, there are no other draws present. I think just he folds often enough to make it profitable in a vacuum to just bet this flop. I would, prefer to have more outs, but I think it's still a spot where we can lead, 3/4 pot, or even 60% pot, and get away with it. As played, I think you just have to check fold, or you could have led the turn as well when he checks back the flop. King Jack 9-6, certainly a good open, but I guess I'm just surprised that, this is weaker than some of the hands you've been folding. So yeah, not having a suit does hurt a decent amount. This is pretty connected, but I think not having a suit hurts quite a bit. So actually, I prefer a hand I don't know, even as weak as 10-7, 7-5 with a suit, I believe, to a hand like this, as far as opening the button heads up, and in most cases. Not that either are premium hands. And now we get 3-bet, and I think folding here would not be bad. Calling, I don't think, is bad. It kind of depends on how he's going to play and how confident you are in your abilities. To make this a profitable call, we are going to have to be, capable of making some moves. And that's not to say I would call with the intention of bluffing. But I'm just saying, if you're calling to hit your hand and play fit or fold, this is a little bit too weak, in my opinion, against a competent player. But I think it's close. Good hand on the right table. We do hate to get check raised here because we're so often up against, either a set or a queen with a higher flush draw, in which case we're just drawing to our set outs and our gutter. So it is very awkward to get check raised here. I still see bet just because, especially against somebody who calls as light as he does so far, just pure value. Because we crush some of the hands he check calls with. So he bets the flop. I want to look at his sizing. We flop an open-ender. Excuse me. We flop an open-ender. He bets, kind of standard size. We call, and the turn's an 8. Not a great card for us. The flop call is standard, in my opinion. I don't think there's another option. It helps that we have the Jack-9, so that the 10 is to the nuts, as is the 5. So I don't like this play at all. And this actually goes back to the concept of, his range. And it actually also has something to do with, the type of hands we're representing. And I guess that this play could be viable if you had the plan to jam rivers, pretty much any river. However, or most rivers, I should say. As a stab here, which I think this might have been, it's very bad in my opinion. When he 3-bets, obviously we did see a marginal hand, but basically all of his hands are going to connect with Queen 8-7 in some way, except for maybe Ace King Jack 5 if he's 3-betting a hand like that. But this is a spot, if he's a competent player, on this 8, he should be betting with the majority of his air. The reason for that is that if you called the flop with an open-ender, which you did, or even with a queen, like a weak queen, or like Queen Jack 10 even, I think that you're in bad shape against any legitimate hand that he's betting, like even aces, which is not, super premium in this spot. He's not excited to get the money in, but when he bets with that hand and you have Queen Jack 10, your 2 pair outs are no good. You're basically drawing to a queen and a gutter. And your open-ender outs, like with this hand, your open-ender outs are still good against aces, but you don't really have odds to call for just an open-ender with one card to come. And you have to worry about the times that he does have Queen, Queen, Queen 8, 7, 8, and then, all of your open-ender outs are completely dead. So this is a spot where he should be barreling, in my opinion, and, most people's opinion, with the majority of his air. So what this check would mean to me, or should mean to me, is that he has some showdown value, like Queen X, King King, Ace Ace, very likely. And a bet of $10 is not going to make him fold that. Now, a bet of $10 and jam on an offsuit 4 river might make him fold that. So betting here with the plan to jam any river that either gives you a straight or is a brick that's lower than the board, I would not be as excited to bet at a king, for instance, just because sometimes it improves him to kings. Like, it just hurts a little bit, although we have a king, so we wouldn't bet anyways, probably. And then flush rivers, I'd be hesitant to bet as well, just because I could see him check calling here with kings with a flush draw, whereas kings without a flush draw, he might choose to just lead and fold to a raise. Kings with a flush draw, he's happier to let you bluff when he checks because he has more equity against your draws. So if your plan was to bomb the river, or is to bomb the river, then it's okay. He folded there, which I don't like his check there. If you're planning to bomb the river there, I think that your bet is good. But otherwise, he's never folding, King Queen or better, which I think is a lot of his range. He's never folding King Queen or better on the turn. Here on the right table, if you choose to bet, it's mostly a protection bet with some equity. I actually think I prefer a check here, just because we're not getting value. I mean, I guess I don't know quite how loose he is, but I'm going to assume he can check fold here with, like, Jack 9, 7, 2. If he can't check fold that, then this is certainly a value bet, but you hate to be check raised here and run into a queen, and you're not really afraid of much by checking behind. He doesn't have a ton of equity. Betting here is also okay, and in PLO, another big concept that I stress, or that actually took me a while to wrap my head around, is that betting for protection becomes a lot more viable than it does in No Limit. In No Limit, I was like, it's always been very important to me to have a reason to bet, and usually those reasons are I'm trying to get value from a worse hand, I'm trying to bluff out a better hand. But in PLO, very often, you know, yeah, you're trying to do some of those things, but for the most part, like in this spot, I'm not trying to bluff out kings. I don't think I'm going to. I'm not trying to make Jack 9 7-5 fold, or sorry, call me, because it's not going to. What I'm trying to do is just, if he has a higher flush draw than me with one or two overcards, I just want my share of the pot, or I want to take down the pot right now to not let him realize his equity. And that, I think, is a reason to bet in a lot of cases in PLO. And this is, I think, it would be a fine reason here. Checking behind, though, is also fine, given that, you know, it is very possible he has a queen, and we'd face a check raise and get blown off of our equity. Now when he leads, I mean, I'd probably fold here, given that he seems so passive so far. But, you know, we're not worried about, like, his non-queen hands don't have a lot of equity against us, since we have, you know, a gutter and the flush draw and the boat outs. If he had an open ender, a lot of his cards that give him an open ender give us a boat. So I like the way we played that hand. King Jack 10-10 single suited. This is a good 3-bet. However, I would urge people who are newer to PLO, especially against kind of tough opponents, I would urge them not to 3-bet very light. And you can still obviously mix it up in terms of, you know, which cards, like having, like connecting with all the boards. But I would rather have King Queen Jack 10 single suited, and like you can 3-bet 6 7 8 9 double suited, things like that. This is a hand, like when you have a pair in your hand that's not often going to flop an overpair, even when your hand's connected, it gets a little bit tough to play. And so obviously we flop top 2 pairs, so right now it's looking pretty good. But I mean, there are a lot of turns that are scary for us. But for instance, pretend this board was like just King 7-6. Now if we bet and get raised, we have to throw our hand away, because we're in bad shape against even King 7, because we only have 2 10s now and 3 jacks, and then we can't hit a king. So 2 10s and 3 jacks is 5 outs against King 7. Whereas if we had King Queen Jack 10, we now have 3 10s, 3 jacks, 3 queens, and now we have 9 outs instead of 5. And you know, if your opponent is going to be jamming some draws there, you could consider going with your hand now, whereas with this hand we couldn't. So having like the pair in your hand that's not, you know, your highest card, oftentimes will lead to you flopping 1 pair with not a lot of outs to improve to 2 pair, and those spots can get very tricky. I'd be opening every button against this opponent, just because, and I would open this against any opponent in the first place. Good. But against him, I think I'd open near 100%, just because of how like loose passive he's playing. I think you can make a profit with any of your hands. We flop a wrap on a paired flush draw board. This is not a good hand, just because of, you know, how tainted a lot of our outs are. We could be drawing dead, but I certainly start by bluffing, or semi-bluffing. And now that we improve, I don't really see much value in betting. The only hand, like, there's nothing to protect from, really. The only hand that we can get value from / protect our hand from is, like, a 4 that slow play the flop, you know, King, Queen, Jack, 4. Anything else, you know, if he has a flush, we're drawing dead. If he has an ace and nothing else, or like, yeah, somehow he's pretty much drawing dead, unless he has, you know, I guess he could have ace 7-6, so his 5 is good, but he's basically drawing dead, or we're drawing dead, so I don't think there's a reason to bet here. Let's just check back and see how he acts on the river. And there's no value. Obviously, there are spots where one of us is, like, either we're drawing dead or he's drawing dead, but there's still value because there are many hands that he's drawing dead with that he might call with. However, this is a spot where if he is drawing dead, I don't expect him to call the turn very often. I guess he is pretty loose, so we could find, or he could find a turn call with an ace. You could consider value betting that river, although I usually would not as well. it kind of depends how loose he is, and I don't know if he's the type that'll check call there with an ace on the end if he somehow showed up with it, or check call with a 3. Maybe he would, but it's hard for him to check call the flop with a 3. I'm curious to see what he check called the flop with. So yeah, top and bottom pair. Not a hand that we're looking to get stacks in with, but certainly a hand that we'd like to get value from a loose calling range. So I like leading out here. This is a board that I wouldn't lead very weak on, just because it's so connected that you expect to get a lot of action from him. Obviously, against stronger players, I would lead weak because they don't expect me to, or because I can't only lead strong on these boards. But against him, a board this draw heavy, I would not be leading very weak. We get 3-bet. We have aces, pretty good aces, or not pretty good, but decent aces. We're gonna 4-bet. Very standard. And this is actually a very tricky situation. I'm curious to see how you played it, and I'm actually not even. There's not a clear correct play in my mind, and it does come down to your opponent. But one option is to go ahead and bet $8 or so, and that's what you're going to want to do anytime that you 4-bet here with like Ace King Jack 10 or any kind of 4-bet light that you made. Is you're going to want to be able to bet $8 to $10 and make him fold his air, which he usually is going to have. Excuse me. When we actually have aces, though, the thing is, if we don't do that with aces, then we lose the ability against a tough opponent to do that with our unpaired hands. With our weak hands, because if we're not doing it with aces, we don't rep a very wide range of value hands. The reason that this, I'm getting ultra beginner here, but the reason this is a good board to make a small bet on, and like with all of our air, is that we are repping aces, and unless he has a 9 or pocket 5s or 6, 7, 8, he doesn't really have outs against aces. If he has, King 10, 10, 8. He's drawn to a 10 excuse me, a 10, or like backdoor kings, like King King, 8, 8, something like that. So he just has to check fold with the majority of his range. However, obviously, when you bet 8, you look like aces, and it's kind of an invitation for him to check raise bluff, and potentially even barrel off. However, checking behind is also an invitation for him to do that. I think it's very close. Because I want to be 4-betting non-ace-ace hands, and I want to be c-betting this flop 100% of the time with those hands, I lean towards betting $8 on this flop as my standard. Checking back sometimes, but usually betting $8. And when faced with a check raise, you just got to play poker and think about, your opponent, his tendencies, game flow, what he thinks you're going to do with your aces, things like that. I don't really like that we snap called his turn bet. I think that shows weakness against most tough opponents. Are going to read that as exactly what our hand is. I also think we could just fold to his turn bet. Honestly, it depends on his tendencies, but any 9, any 5 beats us. It's not that hard for him to show up with those hands, and it's not that hard for him to bomb the river without it. And I don't think I'm comfortable calling here when our hands face up. Again, if you know this opponent, it's different, and it is very dependent on the way he plays and your reads on him. But in PLO, when the board is paired and double paired, it's not as hard as it is in No Limit to have one of those cards. You have 4 shots at it. You have 4 cards in your hand, so it's not as unlikely as you would think for people that have trips. It happens very often. And yeah, now we're faced. So I think that the snap call turn snap fold river. What it shows me is that you're not really thinking the hand through, and not just because you acted quickly, but because it seems like to me you think turn is an easy call and river is an easy fold. And I would argue that when you call the turn, you're going to be faced with the river jam the majority of the time. Yes, the 8 changes things a little bit because he could have been betting with a 7-6 type hand, 6-7-8, or even just like ace-queen 6-7 with or without hearts. So the 8 is more of a fold than, let's say, a deuce. But if you were going to snap fold on a deuce as well, I would say that your turn call is a spew, because I think you're going to be faced with a river bet either from trips or from air. I don't know, 80+% of the time, at least 70% of the time. So in essence, if you don't hit your ace, you're 20 to 30% to win the hand. So you're putting in money bad essentially, without the right pot odds. So yeah, I think the decision to check back the flop is not the one that I would make, but it's fine. I think that that's a perfectly reasonable decision. I think the decision to I think the turn and river are definitely not automatic plays. On the right table, we could have led the flop, although this is a board that we're not really getting him to fold better or call with worse. It's kind of just a protection bet, and we have some value to go, or sorry, some equity to go with it. Same on the turn. I think I would have led the flop, and having checked the flop and him checking behind, I would lead the turn, just because I expect to take down the pot. And I'm not expecting, again, it's just like a protection bet on both streets. Here we 3-bet, and this is a pretty bad flop for us, because it's difficult for us to have a strong hand if we're 3-betting, a relatively tight range. We're not going to have many 5-6-7 combos. We're not going to have many 8-8, 4-4, 3-3 combos. We're going to have maybe almost no 8-4, 8-3 combos. It's just difficult for us to 3-bet many hands that contain those cards. So this is a board, if he's competent, he can be attacking very often. I guess what's protecting us is we can have ace-ace 5-6, we can have ace-ace king-5 with 2 backdoors, or 1 backdoor, and just go with the hand. But all that said, I still like the c-bet until somebody shows me they're going to be super tough on these boards. I still like your c-bet, and there are a lot of good turn cards for you with you have your 3 straight and two backdoor flush draws. So a lot of backdoor draws. On this jack of diamonds, I think I just value bet. I would have gone half pot just to get a crying call from something, since he's a loose player. Pot might scare him away, although it's like a 2 big blind pot, so not as big a deal. Oh, so this is a hand on the left table. We get 3-bet with Jack 10 6-5. This is a hand that's better than the King Jack 9-6 rainbow that we folded earlier. I would certainly call this. I mean, we're not super excited to be getting into a 3-bet pot with this hand, but I think certainly in position, pot odds, implied odds, power position, that kind of thing. I think it's certainly a call. So let's call and see a flop. For the first, the first 2 years that PLO was kind of a big game, or maybe a year and a half, I don't know. It was just kind of accepted everywhere that when you raise in heads up in 6-max, when you raise and you get 3-bet, you just call with all of the hands that you either 4-bet or you 4-bet with strong hands, and then you call with everything else. And I think just in the last year, people have realized that, especially in 6-max out of position, you have to make some folds. And I haven't seen any comprehensive math analysis to support. Again, we should open that button to support. Either theory, I guess, but I certainly think there are room for some folds. When you open a weak hand and get 3-bet, even in position. However, the Jack 10 6-5 is too strong. Yeah, even this hand, King Queen 3-5, very easy open and very easy call when he 3-bets. Just 4 unpaired cards with a suit. I can't think of any 4 unpaired cards with a suit that I want to be folding to a 3-bet in position. I don't know, Queen 7 2-3 maybe. With a suit, with a 7 high suit, you could raise fold. But yeah, I know it hasn't seemed. I mean, we haven't gone through too many hands because I stop and ramble. But I know it hasn't seemed like we there have been a ton of like leaks that I've pointed out other than the preflop leak. But I think actually there are a few spots that it seems like you think are very standard that are tougher decisions. And I do know people that just click fast and they go through the thought process very quickly. A few of my friends are like that. And, times that I've seen videos of them play or watched them play, they just like click buttons really fast. And I'm like, did you think that was standard? And they're like, no, but I, thought it through. Um, and this is, I'm not positive that you're not a player like that just clicks quickly and thinks very quickly. I'm not. I think through things at a slower pace than those 24 tablers. But a lot of these spots, it seems like where you're making very quick decisions, and I just given the way the hands played out, I do believe that you think they're like super easy decisions, or like mandatory calls and then mandatory folds, things like that. Whereas I think that they're certainly worth considering, and that's not to say that any of the plays were wrong, but they're definitely closer than I think you are making them seem, or they seem to you. And what that means is that even though they're close decisions and you're not making a big mistake by making the plays you've made so far post flop, what it shows is like a, in my opinion, incorrect thinking process in a lot of those spots, which will lead to much bigger mistakes as well. Um, because when I'm coaching somebody and trying to figure out their leaks, even the close hands where they didn't necessarily make a mistake, what's important is their thought process, um, because that's what is going to lead you to make all your decisions in poker. And I think figuring out flaws in the thought process is really how you get to the bottom of people's leaks. And I think what I would say, only having watched 11 minutes of you play so far, is other than the pre-flop leak, um, it seems like you're not thinking very much about his hand range or about the way the hand is going to play out. And I think that, yeah, I think like sometimes you're just looking at, okay, I have top pair, so I always call here, call two bets. So in like the ace king 8-7 hand where the board was king queen queen, and he just check called twice very quickly, and you were correct. He had ace jack jack. I definitely don't think either of those calls were bad. I think the flop call is mandatory, turn call is close. But I think you may not have been thinking very much about his range. You may just have been thinking, I have top pair, so I obviously call twice, and then figure it out later. And that's definitely not the case in that spot. And then with the aces, again, I think you may have just been thinking, well, I have an overpair. I have the nut overpair, so I obviously call one, and obviously fold the river because now he's representing better than me. He's not betting the turn with like queens, and then realizing he's beat, and then checking the river. He's betting the turn with a hand that has you crushed or a bluff, and then he's very often going to continue with his bluffs. I think, obviously, I haven't talked to you about your thought process, but I think that you need to be thinking a lot more about his hand range and how his hand range is going to play out on future streets. And so this last hand here on the right table, we see about the flop, check, check, turn, very standard so far. And he pots the river. We don't know a lot about him. I think that obviously we know he's loose passive, which would lead us to not want to call here. However, a lot of weaker passive players are kind of erratic, and you might run into a player that every time he had a flush draw here, or every time he had a 3, or even if he has pocket 5s, is just going to pot this river. And we don't really know enough about him to know he's not doing that. So with 2-to-1 odds, actually, especially early in a session, like to call here. I think the play is going to be, neutral EV, maybe slightly plus EV, maybe slightly losing in a vacuum. But we learn if he does show up with like pocket 4s, we learn a lot about him because that's a pretty poor play, in my opinion, probably a very poor play, and shows a very poor thought process. And we learn more about how we can exploit him. He does show up with quads, and we learn a little bit here. We learn that he didn't check raise the flop with very good trips. And, I mean, the fact that he potted the river, we don't learn very much, but I think, learn a little bit, and sometimes we learn a whole lot. So there, I got through 11 minutes of this footage. There's probably 15, 20 minutes left. I am not sure if I'll continue with this video. I may look into other videos that I get. But basically, I'm going to base that on the feedback I get from you guys. So please let me know. Obviously, there are going to be people that are more advanced in PLO and aren't really interested in this. And I expect you to tell me that. Cool. But what that means is for you guys that are new to PLO and really enjoy stuff like this, you got to let me know. So if all I hear is the negative feedback from people who want more advanced videos, I'm definitely not going to be making one like this again. But yeah, let me know what you guys liked, disliked, and in Leak Finder or like hand history review series or videos, what you would be looking for, and in general, what kind of videos like this or suggestions for these videos. Actually, I know I'm rambling again, but let me know. Even if you didn't like this video, how many of you are interested in micro stakes, low stakes, beginner PLO videos, things like that. Because I just I'm always trying to get a good idea of like the demographics of our members and what kind of videos you guys like to see. So that's all. Thanks for watching. This is Phil Galfond for BlueFirePoker.com. Take care, guys.